This is shoulder girdle retraction or abduction, when the scapula moves closer toward the spinal cord. This is shoulder girdle protraction or abduction, when the scapula moves further apart from the spinal cord. The origin of the deltoid for the anterior fibers is the anterior lateral third of the clavicle, for the middle fibers is the lateral aspect of the acromion, and for the posterior fibers is the inferior edge of the spine of the scapula. The insertion is the deltoid tuberosity on the lateral humerus. The origin of the teres major is posteriorly on the inferior third of the lateral border of the scapula. The insertion is the medial lip of the inner tubercle groove of the humerus. The origin of the latissimus dorsi is posterior crest of the ilium, back of the sacrum, and spinous process of the lumbar and the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae. The insertion of the latissimus dorsi is the medial lip of the inner tubercle groove of the humerus. The origin for the upper fibers of the pectoralis major is the medial half of the anterior surface of the clavicle, and the lower fibers' origin is the anterior surface of the costal cartilages of the first 6 ribs. The insertion is the adjacent portion of the sternum. The origin of the coracobrachialis is the coracoid process of the scapula, while the insertion is the middle of the medial border of the humeral shaft. The origin of the supraspinatus is the medial 2/3 of the supraspinous fossa. The insertion is superiorly on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The origin of the infraspinatus is the posterior surface of the scapula below the spine, and the insertion is the greater tubercle on the posterior side of the humerus. The origin of the teres minor is posteriorly on the upper and middle aspect of the lateral border of the scapula, and the insertion is posteriorly on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The origin of the subscapularis is the entire anterior surface of the subscapular fossa, and the insertion is the lesser tubercle of the humerus. The origin of the supinator is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and neighboring posterior part of the ulna. The insertion is the lateral surface of the proximal radius just below the head. The origin of the triceps brachii for the long head is the infaryngoid tubercle. For the lateral head is the upper half of the posterior surface of the humerus, and the medial head is the distal 2/3 of the posterior surface of the humerus. The insertion is the olecranian process of the ulna. The origin is the posterior surface of the lateral condyle of the humerus. The insertion is the posterior surface of the lateral olecranian process and proximal 1/4 of the lateral ulna. The origin of the biceps brachii for the long head is the supraphrenoid tubercle, and for the short head is the coracoid process of the scapula and upper lip of the glenoid fossa. The insertion is the tuberosity of the radius and bicipital appendicus. The origin of the brachia radialis is the distal 2/3 of the lateral supracondyle ridge of the humerus. The insertion